evening. We have a few questions have come in, so I can answer them tonight. Dear Luang Por, I wish you well and thank you for your teachings. Can you please expand what it means by all Dhammas, conditioned and unconditioned, are not self? Thank you again. Well, all Dhammas, as you said, conditioned and unconditioned, are not self or no self, without self. So self is a kind of natural delusion that the untrained, unenlightened mind has. Keeps taking everything as self, or looking at all aspects of experience from a place where there is this idea of self. Sometimes we call it self-view, sakkaya ditthi, and it's particularly based around the idea of this body, and then the other aspects of the mind, like feelings, memory, thoughts, sense consciousness, based on the body, linked to the body. They're a self. They're either belonging to me, or arising within a self. There is some self that owns them, that kind of delusion. And then we apply that to other people, so they're a self. And sometimes we even apply it to physical objects. So we even call something like a tree, we might say that tree, he or she, or a mountain is a he or a she, or a boat, or something that people build, we say she runs well. We tend to look at things like they're a self, they're a being, a person, a being, whether they are or not. And the implication is that if it's a self, it's something that exists by itself. So the idea is that if you are calling this body a self, you're implying that it's something that exists and that you can own or have or control. But the Buddha pointed out this body is not self, meaning it doesn't just exist, it isn't just here, it comes together through causes and conditions as its component parts, and there's causes leading to the arising of a human being in the world. So the immediate cause is that there's conception, there's a fertile egg, and the sperm come together, and then consciousness, the invisible bit, which is a bit harder to prove or verify through science, but the Buddhist explanation is consciousness joins the fertilized egg and becomes an embryo from the beginning of that process. And if everything goes successfully, then after 9 months or so, a baby is born. But already that baby has come about through these causes and conditions. Embryo, fertilizing egg, fertilized egg, embryo, nutrition, so you get food, say for a baby, it's coming through the bloodstream of the mum. There's air, blood, nutrition, and the basic consciousness, which isn't doing much. It can't speak yet, but it's still conscious, and after the embryo grows for a while, then you feel it. It can move around. Sometimes mums say we can feel it kicking or turning, moving. And of course, once the baby is born, then the sense of self for the baby and for people relating to the baby becomes much stronger. You see the baby and they cry and they're learning to talk and walk and all the things. So the sense of self quite naturally grows stronger, more deep for that consciousness in that baby, identifying with the body and the whole being as a self. We give a baby a name. And we tend to do that with things as well. You create something, you manufacture a car, or you buy a car, or you have that sense, this is my car, even though it's a collection of component parts, metal and rubber. We say my car, even though that car is not a self and it doesn't belong to anyone, it doesn't exist by itself. It was created by a human, and eventually it falls apart. But we still have an identification with that car as my car. Or even land, say, land of this world. The world is a collection of elements, earth, air, fire and water. But we designate land, we say that's my country. So the country of Australia is this island floating in the ocean. And we give it a name, and they say, my country. But the idea, the concept of Australia doesn't exist, didn't it? Once upon a time there was no idea of Australia, there was just land. Once upon a time there wasn't even a world, it hadn't begun yet. Maybe one day in the future the world will heat up and fall apart or disintegrate in one way or another. There won't be a world. But for now we give titles and labels and assumed reality to everything. So we have this sense of self. You may even be so powerful that you think you own the world. You could be an emperor or a president of a country that is powerful enough to feel like they rule the world or run the world, or CEO of a huge world-dominating company, or have more money than anyone else, more assets, more money, and feel like you somehow own the world. So even the world can become a basis for the idea of self. I own this world, or maybe go beyond the world. Some spiritual being, somebody who attains jhana, may even have the sense of self that their mind has expanded beyond the world, fills the whole universe. They might possibly have the delusion that they kind of own the universe or run the universe. It's possible, because the sense of self really has no limit. It's an idea that can expand and shrink as well. So we also have the conceit of inferiority as well as superiority, sense of ownership, sense of I don't own anything, I don't have anything, I'm no good, I'm small, I'm inferior. All of this is expression of self. But in fact, these are all creations of human minds. And the mind itself is not a person or a being, which is what the Buddha pointed out. We may not yet see it, but if we keep investigating and particularly look at the characteristics of impermanence, suffering, meaning things don't last and then they can't bring lasting happiness, they're unsatisfactory, they're a basis for discontent, they're constantly degenerating because they're subject to change, then these help to expose the sense of a lack of a solid, unchanging entity or self. So it's not that there's nothing there in the world. There's a world, there's people, there's things that we create, but it's this wrong belief that there's somehow a self in charge of it or controlling it or making things happen. And sometimes we can influence the world, so that sense of self keeps getting reinforced. And you think, if I have enough money, enough power, enough influence, I'll be able to solve all problems and I won't have to suffer and I can do anything I want. if I get that. So most people aspire to have more money, more influence, more power, more comfort, etc., as an expression of self. And we keep wanting to reproduce, so that's another part of self, isn't it? As we get older, maybe you have family, have kids, and then we project the kid sense of self onto our kids. My child is doing well, my child is not doing well, my child is happy, my child is not happy, healthy, not healthy, and we project ourselves onto our children. And as we get older, maybe that becomes more the focus of our mind. We kind of forget ourselves as we get older, maybe focus more on our kids, and we're always asking, what are our kids doing? Or talk to our friends about our kids, because they're my kids. So the things we have a sense of ownership for, people, property, business, money, ideas. You can even have a sense of self with an idea. That's my idea. I'm the ideas person. I have good ideas, better than them. Could be a basis for religion, politics, business, things of the world, science, knowledge. We can identify with knowledge as self. I discovered a new thing in the world. I created a new thing. Again, sense of self, but what we're missing is the causal process that things arise due to causes and conditions. And our practice of developing the Noble Eightfold Path is to unpick that and look more deeply into that and say, well, actually, this thing we call a self is made up of component parts, physical, mental. And you can apply that to the rest of the world as well. The building blocks of the world are earth, air, fire and water, and then consciousness. So the Buddha pointed out, well, there's some things are without consciousness, some things have consciousness, but there's no lasting, unchanging self that exists in any of it, even though we tend to think that and relate to the world in that way. It's a delusion, it's incorrect. And because we have an attachment to self, we make karma. We keep falling into this habit pattern, this trap you might call it, of making karma due to our desires and attachments to the idea of self. We follow desire, we want to get things, we want to get rid of things we don't like, we want to get things we like. We form a whole elaborate system of how to promote this self, keep the self happy, make the self strong, powerful, on and on it goes. So we keep making karma, and that's what brings the mind back to rebirth. Because there's a sense of self and attachment to self, then you experience more birth. And the Buddha explained enlightenment happens when that cycle is broken. The cycle of causal conditions leading to more birth is broken through the development of mindfulness, insight. No more birth for me, he said, because the sense of self is gone. So the one who's attained Nibbana doesn't experience self in the normal way anymore. There's still a person there, and they know that there's a person there, but there's no more attachment to the idea of self, so then there's no more suffering. That's the purpose of this whole insight, developing insight into no self, not self, is to free the mind from delusion and free the mind from suffering. So the arahant still has a body while they're alive, so they still may feel pain, pleasure. They still go about their business, but they're not creating a self out of what they experience through their thoughts, their feelings and emotions, their body. So there's no attachment, so there's no no fear of death, no desire for anything of the world, because they know nothing in the world can satisfy them. They know that intuitively, so there's no more delusion, seeking things, wanting to make things, get things. So the arahant's mind is very still and pure because it's abandoned the sense of self. And they don't see self in even the most superior being they meet. being who, in a heavenly realm, say, they know that being is still, as long as they've got an attachment to sense of self, that being will still be subject to birth and death. Even heaven ends, and that being is reborn eventually, until they've attained Nibbana and seen through the delusion of self. So it's the core essence, the core teaching of Buddhism, and it informs how the Buddha taught, how he practiced, how he taught people to practice. But you have to start in small ways to see not self, don't you? You practice dana, not just accumulating wealth, but also sharing, giving away wealth. Practice sila, not giving in to your desire when you're angry or greedy to do things that harm others, but you actually keep precepts to prevent yourself making the worst kinds of karma that come from the worst kind of self, killing and stealing and sexual misconduct and so on. That's the worst kind of self. So by keeping sila, living and practicing in a virtuous way, you give up the coarse kind of self, and you develop samadhi to give up the more refined kinds of self, and then ultimately wisdom to give up the subtlest sense of conceit, I-making sense of self. And that's the whole purpose of the Buddhist path. Another question. Good afternoon, Lumpur. I have a question regarding the Mangala Sutta. In the third paragraph, it translates as being rightly resolved in oneself, or as and to apply oneself in the right way. The Pali is Atta Samma Panidhi Cha. My understanding is to be mindful of living life. Is this correct? Or how do you understand it? Being rightly resolved, so right aspiration, right direction, resolving your mind. Applying yourself in the right way, applying your mind, your intentions, you could say. We're training, a lot of practice about training intention in the right way. So this word samma, so we say atta samma. Atta means meaning, purpose. Samma is right. Can't remember what panidhicha means, but samma is right. And the samma, as we chant in the Noble Eightfold Path, samma ditti, samma sankappa. Right means for the ending of suffering. In Buddhism, that's what doing things right means. Right thought, right action, right speech, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Everything is directed towards penetrating the Four Noble Truths to free a mind, a human mind, from suffering. If we're doing things that are creating more suffering, more attachment, more sense of self, more suffering, then it's not right, it's wrong. That's the kind of differentiation or definition of right and wrong in Buddhism. Is it leading to more suffering, or is it reducing suffering? Is it increasing the causes of suffering, mental defilements, greed, anger, delusion? Or is it reducing the causes of suffering, greed, anger and delusion? So atta samma panidhicha, it's like living your life in a way that it's supportive and conducive to the end of suffering. So not doing, saying, or ultimately even thinking things that are promoting suffering through promoting the mental defilements that cause suffering. So if you think about it, well, that means the choices, the decisions, the things you do in life are all becoming part of the path for the end of suffering. So how you earn your living, how you talk to other people, relate to other people, how you go about your business, how you the attitudes you hold, the way you think, the views you hold, the understandings you have, are all being directed towards this goal of reducing suffering, overcoming suffering, and reducing the mental defilements that cause suffering and abandoning them. So that's a blessing, isn't it? If you have someone living like that, they're blessing themselves and they're blessing to others, because they won't be causing harm. They won't be aiming to make bad karma with other people, they'll be aiming to make good karma. Developing mindfulness, as you say, wisdom, living in a virtuous way, they'll be kind, compassionate, cultivating these qualities, and particularly developing insight so they recognize a defilement as a defilement and abandon it once they do recognize it. And that will come through in all aspects of their life. You know, whether they're at home, at work, wherever they are, they'll be directing their mind more towards the practice of Dhamma, abandoning defilements. There's a question in Thai here. ศิษย์มีคำถามค่ะรบกวนขอความเมตตาให้หลวงพ่ออธิบายความหมายของคำว่าสัมปชัญญะและต่างกับคำว่าสติอย่างไรแล้วขอตัวอย่างขอการนำใช้สติสัมปชัญญะ4มาใช้ในชีวิตประจำวันได้ไหมครับขอบพระคุณค่ะ So this question is basically, what is the difference between the terms sati and sampajanya, and then how do we practice sampajanya in daily life? You know, often people ask how to practice mindfulness in daily life. Not often they mention sampajanya, but many teachers such as Ajahn Kalyano talk about sati and sampajanya together quite naturally. And when we talk about the development of the mind in the practice of mindfulness and in samadhi, we tend to use them together as supportive qualities of mind. So we say satima, sampajano, satima, with mindfulness, with clear comprehension. So sati, it depends how you translate it. In Thailand we used to translate it as recollection, which can mean presence of mind, keeping in mind, not forgetting. Sampajanya is clear comprehension, clearly comprehending what the practitioner is clearly comprehending what they're doing, what they're involved with, what's happening. Sometimes translated as all-round awareness or all-round knowing. It's considered an aspect or a function of wisdom. Mindfulness is more a function of samadhi. So as you practice mindfulness, recollecting your object, if you're meditating on the breath, say you keep the breath in mind, you keep recollecting it, remembering it, knowing the breath with mindfulness, samadhi arises, meaning a state of calm, concentration with piti, sukha, one-pointedness. Sampajanya is helping mindfulness, but it's the all-round understanding and comprehension of what you're doing, why. So, in the Visuddhimagga, the commentaries, they talk about different aspects of clear comprehension, sampajanya. They say this, knowing the purpose, why you're doing this, what are you aiming for. Whether you're meditating or doing any other activity, you know what you're doing and why. As opposed to when you're distracted or scattered and you don't really know what you're doing, you've forgotten what you're doing, or you're kind of you think you're doing one thing when maybe you're actually doing something else. So like say you're driving a car and you say, I'm going to the supermarket, but because of your distracted state of mind, you start driving in the opposite direction. Then you may correct yourself. Or more subtle one, maybe you go overseas, like in Australia we drive on the left, and then you go overseas and they drive on the right. And you start driving out of your hotel or wherever you are, and you're driving on the left thinking you're doing your normal driving, and then you suddenly see a car driving before you, ahead of you, coming towards you. And you realize, oh, I'm driving on the wrong road, the wrong side of the road. That's a more subtle one. So it's an aspect of understanding, wisdom, knowing the purpose, knowing the suitability, the appropriateness of what you're doing. So, say you're doing breath meditation and you're really determined to become mindful and keep the breath in mind, you may start, trying so hard that you scrunch your face up and you're really trying to focus your mind on the breath, and you start to get a pain in your nose or a headache because you're concentrating so hard that you get a physical reaction in your body. Maybe that's not the most suitable way to do it, because you're making it impossible to continue. After a while you can't keep that up. You have to relax a bit. You still want to know the breath, but not push and use so much willpower and not let it manifest physically so that you get pain. So maybe that's an example of knowing the suitability. You have to reflect there, don't you? And say, oh, I'm trying too hard, maybe relax. Or maybe you're not trying hard enough and you're sort of sitting there asleep and you're not aware of anything, and you wake up and you realize that this isn't any good. I'm not knowing anything what's going on. So knowing the suitability of what you're doing, knowing what's going on, and sometimes you have to adjust. So not just in meditation, but in any activity, you're knowing, how is this going, and am I doing this properly? What's the outcome? What's going on here? What's the result of my action? What am I aiming for here? Do I need to change my approach, or so on? That's all part of clear comprehension. If you refine it down, you're clearly comprehending, I know the breath is going in, I know the breath is going out, I know the beginning of the breath, the middle of the breath, I know the end of the breath. So knowing aspects of the breathing, knowing whether the breathing is coarse or refined, or knowing when the breath has disappeared, because your mindfulness is so continuous that the body and mind become still, and oh, now it's become very quiet, very still. You know that, and you know why it's happened. It's not like you're in a blank state, or you're dull or hypnotized, or you know that the breath has become very subtle now because you've been following it long enough with mindfulness that it's calmed down, for example. Not just in meditation, but knowing what you're thinking at any one moment. Say, when you're doing a more contemplative type of practice, reflecting on what you're thinking, your state of mind, and knowing, well, is this conducive to peace? Or is this making me more stressed? And that needs some clear comprehension, knowing. You need mindfulness as well, knowing, and then knowing what you're thinking. Where's this leading? Is this fruitful, leading to my happiness, or am I just making myself miserable? Is this going to lead me into an unskillful action that I'll regret, make some bad karma? We use clear comprehension to know what we're thinking, the kind of thoughts, the kind of reflection that's going on in the mind, whether it's wholesome or not, or to know an object of meditation, or maybe just to know a characteristic of, say, impermanence, to know, oh, the breath is going in and out, it's impermanent, or a thought is arising, passing away, it's impermanent. So Sati and Sampajanya work closely together as two friends, and they give rise to and support the arising of wisdom, which comes out of Sampajanya, but it needs the Sati. So it's like the product of Sati and Sampajanya, then wisdom sits on top of them, but works together to do the job of letting go of attachment and seeing that attachment causes suffering, so then letting go. So knowing, if I attached, to this thought, this feeling, I grasp it, I want it, I don't want it, because not wanting is also a form of grasping. I'm suffering. Therefore, let it go. That's wisdom. When you let go of something that's causing you suffering, or a delusion that's feeding suffering, you let it go. You've seen it as a cause of suffering, you let go. You experience maybe the end of suffering at that moment. The wisdom, the insight relies on Sati Sampajanya to be doing their job from moment to moment. So their qualities are always useful, helping us in daily life, as well as in meditation. You develop them in meditation most intensely, but then you apply them and develop them in daily life, whatever you're doing. Another question. Dear Lumpur, I wish you well. Thank you for your teachings. I have listened to one of your talks recently and it was profound and useful to my practice. I am following the 5 precepts and occasionally I try to meditate, but I doubt I am ever going to reach samadhi since the time spent is quite short due to my lack of effort. The lack of effort to meditate maybe is due to my lack of confidence to ever imagine that I could ever purify my mind in this lifetime. Even as I am practicing morality, I know that deep inside the defilements have not yet been eradicated yet, and they are just in hibernation, waiting for the right conditions to come out. Can you please advise how one should be more confident in his or her practice and not be fearful of the defilements? Thank you. Well, one thing the Buddha pointed out is that when you do put effort into living in a virtuous way, keeping 5 precepts and using them as a way of training yourself to refrain from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, divisive speech, and taking intoxicating drink and drugs. When you use those as guidelines, it makes your mind bolder because you gain a certain self-respect, self-confidence, peace of mind, lack of regret. Your mind becomes bolder, more courageous to train in meditation. So it's the ideal, fertile ground for meditation. Because your mind is more at ease when you keep the precepts regularly, when you sit down to meditate, you have a sense of well-being that helps you push against the defilements, push back, resist them, see them, exposes them as well, and it helps you to push back, have a strength of mind or the self-confidence you're talking about, to try harder in your meditation, to put effort into being mindful, to use wisdom, to apply wisdom to help find skillful ways to overcome defilements, like to apply metta when you're falling into anger, to apply restraint when you're falling into sensual desire and so on. And then ultimately to develop mindfulness that stills the mind to see defilements as impermanent, as not self. So the Buddha said the practice of, say, satipatthana, mindfulness, which leads on to samadhi and insight, is purified by the precepts. So don't underestimate the power of the precepts. Definitely what you're doing is correct, put effort into the 5 precepts. And also don't underestimate your mind's ability to develop samadhi out of mindfulness practice in daily life or in formal meditation. Our problem nowadays is that we all get so much information about the Dhamma. We've heard everything from start to finish. We've heard about nibbana and liberation and states of enlightenment, enlightened beings, sotapannas, stream enterers, once returners, non-returners, arahants. we've heard the whole story, the whole path, the way of practice. So once you've heard all this information and you look back at your own mind, you often feel discouraged and think, oh, I'm far away from Nibbana, I'll never achieve it. And look at me, I've got all these very ordinary thoughts, or coarse thoughts, and I've got all these complicated things I do in my life. I'm so far from the Dhamma, what's the point? We're very good at undermining our own efforts, going towards negativity, self-doubt, self-criticism, false humility sometimes as well. So that's part of the practice, learning to be more patient with those thoughts, but not give in to them and recognize them as another obstacle on the path. Don't believe them. You have to counter that maybe with a bit more positive inputs. Yes, I can do it. Yes, I have the abilities, the same kind of body and mind as a Buddha or an enlightened being has. Men and women since the time of the Buddha have been practicing this and gained results. They've gained samadhi, they've gained insight. Read stories, read the lives of the enlightened disciples, whether it's in this day and age or in the time of the Buddha. Don't give in to the doubts. It's normal to have doubts come up, but don't believe them so much that they stop you practicing. Find ways to inspire yourself. So listen to the Dhamma from current teachers, read the suttas, read about the lives of enlightened beings from the past up until the present. Things that inspire you, to give you more energy to go through the doubts, the negativity, and try and recognize the potential in yourself. Even though it needs to be developed more, it's there. So don't give up. So find ways to inspire yourself. And listening to Dhamma, reading the Dhamma can help. And associating with Kalyana Mitta, fellow practitioners, helps. You see other people do it, and then you feel, oh, they can do it, maybe I can do it. So you get these positive inputs to help counter the self-doubt and the negativity that might hold you back when you're on your own and your mindfulness is a bit weak. You don't believe that. Last question today. If the first foundation of mindfulness involves being mindful of the body, why aren't medical doctors good at meditation? Or why don't they get enlightened quickly? Perhaps I should have someone else answer that. But anyway, I'll answer it. Well, it's just pointing out the difference between education, knowledge, intellectual knowledge, even practical knowledge. If you're a doctor or a medical professional, you'll have knowledge of the body. You can remember it, you understand how it works, you can fix it, treat it for different conditions. It's all good stuff, but it's more on the physical level, isn't it? We still have to bring that into the mind and educate the mind in the way of Dhamma, Sila, Samadhi, Panya. So doctors, just as anyone else, they have their own attachments, sense of self, and they may be very busy. That's probably the first thing. So busy they feel they've got no time to meditate. So best thing for a doctor would be to get onto a meditation retreat, I would say, and take up some regular time to meditate every day. Get up earlier, meditate in lunch breaks, evening time, whenever. Do a bit of formal meditation will help. Because what we've got to do is turn the intellectual knowledge into what we call bhavana maya panya, the knowledge, the knowing and the knowledge that comes from meditation. Training in mindfulness and then insight, developing insight into the body, the nature of the body from a peaceful mind. So the intellectual knowledge is certainly a good bonus. It's like a head start in a way. You've got visual images, you've got understanding, you know human beings very well. Maybe your best of all would be maybe a surgeon who's opening up the body and they know the body from the inside. So they've already got an awareness on one level of the unattractive nature of the body, the impermanent nature of the body, and even in the lack of self in the body, in the sense that, you know, people are getting ill, they can't stop that, they can't control their bodies, and ultimately the body will die. Often medical professionals of all kinds will become more aware of that. They know people die, they know the body is impermanent, and they see the unattractive side all the time. But they haven't yet drawn it into their mind. That's why they need to still the mind, quieten the mind with meditation. And then maybe some of that knowledge can resurface. So I know some doctors who, when they're peaceful in their meditation, images of the body arise very easily, and they can contemplate the unattractiveness of the body, maybe pick on one aspect of the body, you know, maybe do their own autopsy, mental autopsy on themselves, or see themselves as a corpse, or contemplate their bones or their blood or some aspect of their body, because they've got the imagery in their memory. They're more familiar with the body. That can help for sure when they're peaceful. But first they have to get to that point where they're peaceful and beyond the hindrances. And doctors and anyone else, you know, have the same problem there. They have to practice mindfulness directed back to themselves. Feelings, body, feelings, mind objects. 4 foundations of mindfulness. That takes a bit of time, so the doctors have to find the time to meditate. Then there's a chance they can use their knowledge, put it to good use. They're already putting it to good use to help people, cure people, solve people's health problems. But there's a deeper problem, the problem of attachment that causes the suffering. So, you know, doctors still get angry, still subject to greed, still have a sense of ego and self. They still get afraid, annoyed, worried, anxious. They still have suffering and stress. And the only way they can uproot that is by turning attention inwards to develop mindfulness, and then samadhi, and then insight. So they have to practice as well as using their skills to help people out in the world, which is a good thing. But take some time to do the meditation. Then you can use that knowledge to free the mind from the defilements as well. Mm-hmm. And we know in the time of the Buddha, Jivaka, the Kumarapata, the doctor for the Buddha and the Sangha, you know, it's possible for doctors with their great medical knowledge to also practice the Dhamma, attain the Dhamma, attain samadhi, attain insight, remove the defilements through their practice, as well as practicing as a doctor. It's possible. Luang Por Plien used to come here. He's a very wise and peaceful monk, even with psychic powers, and he always, as a layperson, aspired to be a doctor. He never completed the studies to become a doctor, but he began them. He was a sort of rudimentary village doctor, and he was always interested in medical knowledge. He'd talk to doctors. He had quite a lot of knowledge, medical knowledge he gained himself, and he could talk quite a lot about health issues, the body, and of course he could meditate on the body very well. He had good samadhi, good insight. And over the years there's been a few monks who have come from the medical profession, people who've come into the monkhood, become monks, and I'm sure they've used some of their medical knowledge then to turn to develop insight, vipassana, insight into the impermanent, unattractive nature of the body, and helps them to abandon certain defilements. So we encourage all doctors, like everyone else, keep practicing. So yes, doctors should be more enlightened, just as monks should be more enlightened. Just because you're a monk doesn't mean to say you're guaranteed enlightenment yet. You have to follow the path, cultivate the path, just as a doctor does, or a builder, or a teacher, or a shopkeeper, or anyone else. You know, we all have to develop this path. So I'll leave those answers with you tonight.